Good morning, folks. Welcome to Half and Half. September 4th, we are starting the semester, new season. I know it's not officially fall, but I always feel like September starts the fall because of everybody going back to school. As promised, Scott and I are thinking about working with themes for a little bit, maybe through each month, 4 or 5 weeks on a theme. And we asked for some suggestions. And a couple that we are thinking about are the pelvic floor and forward bending. So those were two different suggestions, but they are very connected. How the pelvic floor works has a lot to do with how you do forward bends. So thinking in September, we're going to start with those ideas, maybe weave them together. And yeah, that's kind of the thought. So again, if you have other suggestions, other thoughts, things you'd like to see this fall slash winter as we go into the end of the year, let us know. Type it into the chat or send an email if you're not great with YouTube chat. I know for some people it's not so great. And you can always send an email to info@Pilates on Harrison. But let's get started. So pelvic floor, I am with the very tiny skeleton. And thought we'd start with that, looking at what is the pelvic floor. So I think for many people, the way we know the pelvic floor is at some point you've been told, we'll stop your flow of urine and then let it go again, and then you've worked your pelvic floor muscles, which is not untrue. That is a true thing, but it's not a very specific instruction, right? Like it's a pretty broad instruction. So not a bad thing to do, but maybe we could get a little more nuanced as we like to do. And one thing for, I think both Scott and I, when we start teaching pelvic floor and talking about pelvic floor a little more, what I noticed for myself when I started working with it is I immediately, or I originally, when I was working with pelvic floor, would kind of work the muscles and try to, I'd study the muscles and then I'd try to squeeze, and that feeling of stopping the flow of urine, and then I'd let it go and I'd squeeze and I'd let it go. And then I did some meditation stuff where you were squeezing it for a long time. And mostly I just found my back would start to hurt doing it that way. And so over the years, and as I studied it more and more, one of the things I realized is that my pelvic floor maybe was coming on, but a lot of other stuff was coming on. And I was trying so hard to activate it that I was activating a bunch of other stuff with it, right? So my lower back, my psoas, maybe some abdominals, my glutes, my rotators, just like everything was coming on. And when everything comes on, you probably haven't done that much good for the pelvic floor, honestly. You're probably like, it's coming on this much. Maybe it's just kind of following it. You're not getting that much out of the pelvic floor work that way. So that's the first thing I often talk about, is not trying too hard when you start thinking about the pelvic floor. That it's an involuntary muscle for the most part, and involuntary muscles are designed to not have a ton of sensation, right? Your diaphragm, you can't really feel your diaphragm. It's a strong muscle, but it's an involuntary muscle. And that's because if you felt it turning on and off every time you took a breath, what else would you do in your day, right? Like it's just information. Your brain and your body are really smart, and they say, well, we don't need to focus on this. This is just going to happen. So then when we first start thinking about it, we just know there's not a lot of sensation. And so visualizing is a little better. And I find that thinking about the bone movement is more beneficial than thinking about the muscle feeling. The muscle feeling, all the other stuff turns on. I just work so hard in those other muscles. The bone movement that happens with pelvic floor, it was really helpful for me when I started working that way. And then also the image. This one's kind of hard for a lot of people to imagine something really specifically without immediately trying to feel it, to separate those two things. I'm going to imagine the pelvic floor muscles. I'm going to imagine the movement of the bones. I'm going to imagine some engagement and release, but I'm not going to expect a lot of sensation. And the way I describe it to people sometimes, or I hear people say, I think I might be feeling something, but I might just be making it up. That's often the feeling you want. That sort of like, I kind of think it's possible I'm feeling something, but I don't know. It might just be in my head. That's actually the feeling you're going for when you have that kind of sense. That's like that image, embodied image, I would say that's part of it. Okay, long intro for that. There might be a fair amount of talking, but it'll be useful in today and coming weeks. So what are the bone movements? So the pelvic floor is basically muscles that run at the base of the pelvis. So I have tailbone, which is the bottom of the sacrum, bottom of the spine here. And these are my two sits bones here. So I've kind of, he's sticking his butt out, right? So the sits bones usually are hanging a little lower, but I have it kind of pushed this way, so he's sticking his butt out. So your sits bones, your sitting bones, they're kind of your butt bones here. Some people are bonier than others. My nephew, sometimes my sister refers to him as pointy. He's very pointy. So some people have pointy sits bones, but I think we all kind of know where those are. So the two sits bones, the tailbone, and then also you could have the pubic bone as kind of the front part here, right? Way down low, the pubic bone. In between all those bones, you've got pelvic floor muscles. And so those are the bones that get affected when we do pelvic floor release or engagement. There's going to be some movement with the sits bones spreading out a little wider when the pelvic floor releases, the sits bones moving in towards each other when the pelvic floor engages. So there's a widening in the sits bones, there's a narrowing in the sits bones, back and forth that way. So that's one action that can happen with the pelvic floor. It's not a huge action, but there's some movement for sure. With the sacrum, with the tailbone, it has sort of a forward and back movement. So it has a special name called sacral mutation, but basically the sacrum tips forward or the sacrum comes underneath. And this is actually separate from the rest of the pelvis. It has a little back and forth in the sacrum. That's another thing that happens with pelvic floor movement. And so they all three can actually go together. The sits bone spreading and the tailbone going back, sits bones coming together and the tailbone coming forward. It gets a little complicated, but that's basically what can happen with pelvic floor. And then in the front, in the pubic bone, you have two bones that come together. We call it the pubic bone, but it really is two bones that meet. And in the middle, you've got some cartilage called the pubic symphysis. And there's just a little movement of the pubic bones, kind of like the tops of the pubic bones move towards each other, the bottoms of the pubic bones move towards each other. And they have a little bit of movement there. It's really kind of pretty. It looks like the pelvis looks kind of like a butterfly, right? Kind of movement that way. It's kind of cool. We have all these little movements in the body. So that's a lot of information. There's no quiz, but of course you could always go back and review that on YouTube if you want to. But we'll keep coming back to some of those ideas. I just want to give you a sense of where the pelvic floor is and what kinds of actions we might play with the pelvic floor. So I'm going to take Mr./Mrs. Skeleton away, and then we'll do a little movement. I could have said Mr./Ms. too. Maybe it's not Mrs. So first let's come up to standing. And we'll set up with your feet just a little bit open and the toes pointing out just a little bit. And then one of the ways to find the sits bones, I think, is to bend your knees. Scott often teaches sumo squat. To bend your knees and then stick your butt out, right? And that's that sumo squat position. Often I tell you not to stick your butt out, but we're going to stick your butt out right now. And then reach around and very indelicately grab your sits bones, grab your butt. And the reason I think it's useful to bend forward here is it just generally is a little easier to find those bones when you bend forward. Even if you have some padding back here, you can often find the bones a little better if you bend forward and bend your knees. So once you think you find those bones, then we'll come back up to standing. So maybe they're more or less prominent, but you have some sense of where they are through there. So I talked about the sits bones going wide and then coming together, right? I did that movement back and forth with the sits bones. So that tends to go with a particular movement. When I bend my knees, the sits bones should spread wide apart. When I straighten my legs, the sits bones should draw in towards each other. So bending the knees, the sits bones get wider. Straightening the legs, the sits bones come towards each other. Now I'm not leaning forward anymore. It's up to you. You could lean forward a little, or you could be pretty straight up and down. But because I'm not bending forward very much, I can't actually feel the sits bones all that well from my fingers anymore. I've got my fingers kind of reminding me where they are, but I'm having to do that imagining sensation of sits bones getting wider and sits bones moving towards each other a little bit. And just simple, right? Not effortful. This is a natural movement in the body, but it's one we often lose. Just, you see little kids, little babies, they just drop into a squat, right? And in some cultures where they sit on the floor a lot, they can still drop into a squat even when they're much older. But for most of us, we can't just drop into a squat anymore. So take it down and hold that position there. Now, take your hands away. Maybe they're already away. And then just see if you can visualize down where the sits bones are. Maybe there's a little sense of visualizing it, maybe a little bit of sensation there. Imagine they just kind of spread out. And that means the pelvic floor muscles are lengthening or broadening, right? Making a broader base. I'm just going to breathe there. If nothing else, you're bringing awareness to the base of the pelvis. Even that is enough. Just how much do you think about the base of your pelvis and the muscles through there? Definitely some leg work going on. That's okay. Don't get too distracted there. And then coming back up. And release. I'm going to do that same thing again. Sits bones. Wider sits bones. Hold it here. Pause. Breathe. Be aware of the base of your pelvis. Imagine a wide base of the pelvis. And back up. One more time. Exhale. Breathe. Imagine the base of the pelvis. Sits bones broad. And then back up. And then relax. Bring your feet together. Stand for a moment. Just observe what things feel like around your hips, around your butt, and wherever else. Maybe even all the way through your feet. Now, if you are following the anatomical language, we could keep going with the idea of hip flexion. So what we did when I asked you to have a really broad pelvic floor, we were in hip flexion, right? We were in the beginning of a squat, right? Sort of a squat position. So pelvic floor widens. That goes functionally really well with hip flexion, those two things together. And then I talked about narrowing the sits bone on hip extension with the front of the leg straight. So as far as functional use of the pelvic floor, when I'm standing up, my weight really should direct all the way to my feet. So the sits bones just kind of get out of the way, right? Pelvic floor comes on a little more, sits bones come together, pelvic floor gets a little narrower so that my weight can go all the way to my feet. When I sit in a chair, when I go to a squat, when I sit on the floor, the weight should be on my sits bones. So my sits bones get broader. My pelvic floor gets broader, gives me a broad base. Weight can distribute through that. And then we know for a lot of us, when the hips are tight, we're not sitting on the sits bones, right? We're a little behind the sits bones. Yeah, I'm a little kind of leaning back, trying to sit up. That kind of thing happens a lot. That's the pelvic floor getting really narrow as part of what's happening. There's a lot going on, but part of what's happening is the sits bones have drawn together, the tailbone's sort of tucked under. That's that narrow pelvic floor. So one of the ways you can sit up a little bit more is broad, open sits bones, tailbone just kind of floating back behind you. Scott talks about that all the time, right? Let the tailbone float back behind you. That's that broad pelvic floor idea. You look at an animal, they tend to do that, right? They send their tail back behind them. They kind of widen their haunches as they sit. And then as they stand up, their haunches all sort of look kind of narrow, right? So that's really natural movement. So maybe you're down on the floor with me. Maybe you're not. Come down to the floor if you're not down here. And we'll do it just a little bit more with that idea. So we're going to go onto your back. Bend your knees. Set your feet on the mat. So hip flexion or hip extension here. That's your little pop quiz. If you said hip flexion, yes, that's where we are. Hip flexion here. So that means pelvic floor broad. So here we are. You're not going to really do anything, right? You're just going to think sits bones. We're going to see if you can be aware of that space. You're going to think pelvic floor. You're going to be aware of that space. You're going to imagine really relaxed, a little bit broad. And then breathe. Hands onto your lower abdominals. So now here's another subtle question. For a couple breaths, think about tightening your abdominals and play with this a little bit. So often I talk about tone in your abdominals. I don't say tense, I don't say contract. And part of the reason is sometimes when you think of contracting your abdominals, everything comes on, including the pelvic floor. Sits bones come together, butt squeezes, thighs squeeze, abdominal squeeze. So see if you can make that action. It might naturally happen to you. But notice, like sometimes I turn the stomach on and I also kind of tuck my pelvis and then I tighten everything kind of down around the low glutes. That's the pelvic floor coming on with the abdominals there, among some other things. Again, it's not a bad movement. We just want to be really clear that we know what's happening here. Is it really what you want to do in this moment? So if you've got a sense of what that feels like, can you go back to that broad, relaxed, wide sits bone pelvic feeling, easy, relaxed tailbone feeling, and then engage your lower abdominals. What does that feel like? Let it go. Exhale. Tone in your lower abdominals. Does it automatically tighten down in the sits bones? Does everything get super tense, or can you balance the abdominals coming on without getting really tight down in the pelvic floor? And it might be somewhere in between. You might feel a little sensation there that's different when your abdominals come on, but it's not that tuck and grab everything feeling I was showing, right? That would be okay too. So once you have a sense of that, we're going to take knee folds. One knee up. Exhale, take the foot down. Abdominals are going to stay on the whole time. Other knee up. Exhale, taking that foot down. So a little deeper sensation in the belly. And the image, that sort of imagined sensation of the sits bones being soft, the muscles around the sits bones being a little soft. One more time. Now, let's take the alternating right leg up on the inhale. Hold it there. A little more belly. Left leg up. Nice broad sits bone. First leg down. Exhale. Second leg down. And then start with your second leg. Whatever leg you put down, bring it up. Exhale. Second leg. First leg down. Second leg down. Switch legs. Coming up. Exhale. Easy sits bones. Tone in the belly. Last time, starting with the other leg. And then relax everything for a couple breaths. Breathe however you like. Whatever feels natural. Okay, we're going to test those same feelings in the mini crunch. Hands behind your head, elbows a little up. We haven't talked about the upper abdominals very much, but take a minute. See if you can feel the lower ribs settling. And then same thing, focus on lower abdominals without tightening around your tailbone, without tightening around your sits bones. And then bring your head up. Now we're going to do the same exploration we did a minute ago. Tuck your pelvis, tighten with the sits bones, tailbone. You kind of lift up almost like you're starting a bridge. And then see if you can go back to that neutral place. Let it go. Let the sits bones release. Find or imagine a sense of tone in the belly. Try that a couple times. Pull it all together. Feel how your tailbone tips up. And then see if you can let it go. Keep your belly, but just relax your sits bones, right? I could go too far and then I lose my belly, right? Subtlety is key. We're using the scalpel, not the, what do they say? Something like that. I don't know. We're using the scalpel, not a chainsaw. Is that what it is? Release that. And then lower your head down. Okay, so we're going to play with it a little bit. Breathe in. This time as you come up, what naturally happens? Which thing do you naturally do? Just observe it. And then whatever that natural thing you do is, adjust it. Get to that place where you have nice broad release sits bones, some tone in the belly. And then lower down. 2 more. Exhale. Coming up. And stay. Second exhale, refine it a little bit. Coming down, last one. And lowering down. And take your arms down. And then relax everything down for a couple breaths. Okay, we're going to stay where we are. Bend your knees back again. And then we're going to go into bridge. So bridge starts in hip flexion. And then as you come up, hip extension, right? That's part of bridge, is going into hip extension, where this right here is very flat. Then I come back down, I'm in hip flexion again, where I have an angle at the front of my hips, right? So pelvic floor, going to change a little bit too. I start with that kind of released broad sits bone image, broad tailbone image. First thing I do is kind of roll the tail under. And as I roll the tail under, I could imagine the sits bones just drawing together a little bit. And then as I come up higher and higher, the image of the sits bones, the tailbone, all just coming together. Now, maybe you feel a little muscle sensation down there, but you don't need to effort it, right? Really deep muscles. The effort is going to be your glutes. It's not going to be your pelvic floor, right? It's a real simple, sits bones draw together, tailbone draws under. Rolling back down. And then let it all release back to neutral. And going again. Rolling up. Back down. One more time. And then as you get to the bottom, settle. And then bring yourself up to sitting. Okay, so as you come up to sitting, just do a little check-in here. What's it like if you kind of shift forward a little, think of the sits bones a little broad. Sometimes people would give that cue to like pull the flesh off your sits bones. We don't need to do that much, but there's a little sense of the bone, right? Just kind of wide, like you have this nice broad base to sit on. Imagine that just release through there. Creates a nice, broad, solid foundation for you. Okay, so speaking of foundations, I feel like we laid some foundation here. Let's see where Scott takes us as we switch off.
Sorry, everybody. That was probably a funny sound. All right. So it's interesting timing. I was teaching an individual session just yesterday at the Pilates studio, and we were working with releasing pelvic floor tension. And so an image I'll oftentimes use is to imagine a plumb bob. Maybe you've used a plumb bob in construction or a creative project. So I'll sometimes imagine my tailbone hanging out of my skull like a plumb bob. So let's take a few moments. So feet comfortably on the floor. Head gently held high. And then just like a plumb bob effortlessly hangs down under the influence of gravity. Let your tailbone effortlessly drop out of your skull. So what this isn't is tuck the tail, nor is it push the tail back. Let your tailbone drop. Now, as Collette mentioned at the outset, sometimes that doesn't feel like much. In fact, if that really feels like something, it's probably not the thing. So less effort rather than more effort. So let's continue this imagery. Step your feet apart. Turn your left foot in and then your right foot out. Let's pause here for a moment. Continuing to let your tailbone drop out of your skull. And exploring that sense of ease as you exhale and bend your right knee. Inhale and straighten it. down, and up. So let's do 3 more knee bends. On the third one, we'll hold. All the while, let your tailbone effortlessly hang out of your skull. So next time knee in the bent position, let's pause there. Now a continuation of what you explored when you were on your back a few moments ago. Continue letting your tailbone drop out of your skull. Invite awareness to your lower belly. And ever so slightly, draw your lower belly in and up. Lightly engage your abs. So again, if this feels like a lot, it's too much. If it's barely perceptible, you're on the right track. So like you did in the knee folds, explore tone in your lower belly, independently of grabbing your pelvic floor muscles. Yeah, a few more breaths here. Come on up. Turn back to the front. And now the other side. Turn your right foot in, your left foot out. Let's do a few movements. Exhale, bend. Inhale, straighten. And all the while, whether knee is bending or straightening or somewhere in between, let your tail drop to the floor. Now, this can be particularly hard, especially if maybe you have some bladder control stuff going on. That very often there can be an association with relaxing any part of the pelvic floor, maybe with leakage. So, of course, do what you need to do. But quite often, tense muscles are weak muscles. And it can be tempting to try and strengthen the weak muscles by tensing them. And that can create a cascade. Weaker muscles, more attention, weaker muscles, weaker muscles. You can see where this is going. So next time that knee in the bent position, pause there. So think about that plumb bob or a yo-yo, whatever it may be, it just hangs effortlessly. Let your tailbone and your sacrum hang out of your skull effortlessly. Now, invite just a little bit, almost imperceptible tone into your lower belly, below your navel, drawing in and a little bit up, but without grabbing your pelvic floor or your tailbone. And a few more breaths here. Inhale, come up. Exhale, turn back to the front. And then step your feet together. So now same thing here. Tailbone, pelvic floor, less rather than more effort. Lower belly draws in toward your back, little bit up toward your skull. Barely perceptible effort. And a few breaths here to find that interface of tone and support, free from tension. Good. Now, maintaining that interface, and it's dynamic. It's not like we set it and forget it. Perhaps moment by moment, you're releasing your tailbone. It releases the tenses, release again. Or moment by moment, tone in the belly, now it's tense in the belly. Tone in the belly, now belly who? So find that interface, that balance. Cultivating that balance, bring both arms forward. Maybe you've already noticed that between your shoulder blades, your upper back, there's more space back there when your arms are forward like this. Divert your inhale into the space in your upper back. Full, inflate, expand. Then exhale, float your arms up. And we'll hold here for a spell. Continue letting your tailbone hang out of your skull. Use your lower belly to support the lift in your arms. Come on down. And a few breaths here. Now let's make our way to head down dog. With the next out breath, arms up, using your lower belly to support the rise up of your arms. Then fold. Remember hip flexion, what happens to the sitting bones? They go apart, don't they? So let's pause for a moment with your head hanging down. And whether you feel it or not, sitting bones slide apart with this depth of hip flexion. And with the next out breath, reach the crown of your head forward. And then step your feet back. So here we are as promised, head down dog. So especially if you have a side view here, you can see this is really deep hip flexion, isn't it? So a lot of times when people say, oh, my hamstrings are super tight, I really need to stretch my hamstrings. What they're really saying is that their pelvic floor muscles are really tense. So imagine your two sitting bones sliding apart. And that space in the pelvic floor can facilitate hip flexion. Let's take a few more breaths here. And then come on down and all the way into sitting. All right, so sorry for that interruption. It looks like probably our internet dropped out momentarily and interrupted the stream. So we were in down dog just a moment ago, exploring that the hip flexion of downward facing dog is related to that freedom, that mobility in the pelvic bones that Collette described so clearly. And so as Collette shared with you in sitting here, what we often describe as tight hips, what do I need to stretch, is really a lot of pelvic floor tension that restricts the natural capacity of your hips to move into flexion. So in this relaxing of the tailbone, finding more freedom for the sitting bones to slide apart, what we often say or describe as tight hips naturally takes care of itself. So it's not to say that if your knees are way high up, it's just because your pelvic floor is tight. You may have some tight hip muscles too. But virtually everybody, tension in the pelvic floor is at least a contributor to the experience of tight hips. So whether you're sitting on the floor or sitting up on something, continue exploring, relaxing your tailbone, let it hang out of your skull like that plumb bob. And then let's do a spinal twist. Bring your left hand across, right hand behind, and a few breaths. And come on back to the middle. Few breaths here. Pelvic floor muscles. Relax just like you'd relax your neck or your forehead. So there's no muscle in the human body that needs to be tense in order to go about your life, including your pelvic floor. Now twisting the other side. Right hand comes across, left hand behind, and steady breathing. And back in toward the middle. Notice what leg is in front. For me, it's my left leg is in front right now. Park that in your memory bank somewhere. And back to head down dog. So as we spoke of a little bit earlier, right before the stream dropped. So head down dog is a depth of hip flexion. What often restricts hip flexion is pelvic floor tension. So let your tailbone relax, let your two sitting bones release away from each other. And for a lot of people, they report, oh yeah, my pelvis is now freer to rotate forward. It's more accessible for the legs to be straighter. Now, not to imply that they must be straight, but needs a little bit straighter. Without getting too far ahead of us for what we'll cover in forthcoming weeks, releasing pelvic floor tension lets some people drop their heels down closer to the floor. And whatever your experience may be, let's take a few more breaths here. And with the exhale, step your feet forward to gorilla. Inhale, fold. Roll all the way up. Arms down. Stand tall. Let your spine hang out of your skull, just like a horse's tail would hang toward the ground. In fact, the lowest part of the spine is in the Latin word for horse's tail, cauda equina. So let your cauda equina drop down, which includes your sacrum and your tailbone. And keeping that ease as you step your feet apart. Turn your left foot in, right foot out. Cauda equina, the horse's tail, as you bend your right knee. Now, tail hanging down to the floor, in just a moment that image is no longer going to be applicable, but the concept remains applicable. Slowly tip your hips, let your spine, neck, and head follow as you move your spine from the vertical to the diagonal. Continue exploring, releasing tension in your pelvic floor. Continue exploring a light, gentle tone in your lower belly. And bring your left arm forward and through, using your lower belly to generate the outstretch through your fingertips. Then a little turn to look up at the ceiling. And then come on up, back to the front. So now the image of hanging straight down is applicable again. Cauda equina. Turn your right foot in, left foot out. Image is still applicable as you bend your knee. Concept applicable, image no longer so applicable. As you tip your hips. Let your head follow your hips, not your head lead your hips. And we'll take a moment here to settle into the diagonal, exploring healthy tone in the lower belly, free from tensing your pelvic floor. Then reach your hand out of your lower belly. And take a little peek at your ceiling. And inhale, come on up. Back to the middle. And then turn both feet out. Cauda equina. Keeping your tailbone relaxed as you bend, ankles, knees, and hips. Pause here for a spell. See, we're in that hip flexion again, aren't we? And then come on up. Let's do that again. Come on up. And then turn both feet back forward. So in a moment, we're going to fold forward in a way that I don't often share with you in this class. So best you can, fold from your hips, hip flexion. And some people bend way over forward, but a lot of people, this is kind of a hard forward bend. Go ahead and let your spine round. Maybe your hands come to your shins, maybe to the floor. And wherever your hands end up, let's take a few breaths here. And then come on up. All right. So sometimes the best way to explore, to experience ease, is to consciously tense up. So take your two sitting bones, remember those sitting bones, and pull them together. Use your pelvic floor muscles to pull them together. Okay, so we got some pelvic floor tension going on, don't we? Keep that pelvic floor tension, keep pulling your sitting bones together, and then fold forward. Go ahead, fold forward. It's hard, isn't it? Go ahead and come on back up. So this is to demonstrate what Collette introduced for us, is that hip flexion is integrally related to the pelvic floor. So now let your sitting bones slide apart, let them relax, cauda equina, and then invite your sitting bones to further slide away from each other as you fold forward. And you feel how there's more freedom now to create hip flexion? So once again, a lot of times what we call tight hamstrings, what we call tight hips, is really about pelvic floor tension. Couple more breaths here, releasing pelvic floor tension to facilitate hip flexion. A lot of words ending with un. And now slowly, gradually come on back up. Bring your feet back together. And explore standing with a little bit of support from your lower belly that helps support the lift of your head. Head held high provides the support for your tail to drop, to hang. All right, back to sitting. Remember how before you crossed your legs, one leg was in front? Have the other leg in front. So right now I'm on the back of my sitting bones. So I'm going to explore letting those sitting bones slide apart, and that facilitated deeper hip flexion. Twisting to your right, left hand across, right hand behind. Back to the middle. Twist to your left, right hand across, left hand behind. Back in toward the middle. Then take both legs out in front of you. And this is where so many people are in the very backs of their sitting bones, sometimes even sitting on their sacrum. So it can sure look like tight hamstring. Tight hamstrings may be a part of it, but so often as the pelvic floor releases its tension, more able to sit up. So continue exploring releasing your tailbone and associated pelvic floor tension as you create more hip flexion and fold forward. Let's take a few breaths here. And then come on up. Now let's take a moment to relax. So you could remain seated if you like, or if you prefer, you could recline. There's been a lot of focus on tailbone and horse's tail. Let's let all that go for the time being. And take a minute to work on the exact opposite side of the cranial sacral system. Invite awareness to your scalp and your forehead, and invite them to relax. So often, and it's like the scalp and the forehead are gripping the skull bones. So like a tablecloth effortlessly rests upon the table. Let your scalp and your forehead effortlessly rest upon your skull. So let's take a few more breaths here, to whatever extent you're experiencing relaxing, letting go of tension. And then if you closed your eyes, open them. And then come on up to sitting. All right. So thank you for the request to talk about pelvic floor and forward bending. And in future weeks, we'll continue unpacking this idea. Really glad you could join us. I have a fun program coming up here starting next week. I'm calling it Pilates for Old Jocks. I leave it to you to define what an old jock is. And it's going to be about how to use Pilates to support your active life. And it's going to be some of the ideas we've talked about and also some new ideas that maybe you haven't heard before. And I personally feel that Pilates is what allows me to stay active and pretty much as active as I have ever been in my life. And I'd like to share those techniques with you all. So you can sign up. I think the link is in the chat. And yeah, we got a great group already formed, and I'm hoping you can join us. Before we part for the day, any comments, questions? Sorry about that break in the stream. Hopefully you rejoined on the second video, and we were able to complete the thread we had going. Thanks so much. Let's do it again soon.